The casket was closed and the church was nearly empty, and the woman in the third pew did not know that the man who would change her life was already in the air, 8 hours out, watching the dark ocean slide beneath the wing. Her name was Renata Cole, and on the morning of the funeral, she had done what she did every Friday of her adult life. She had risen at 4. She had pulled the bowl down from the high shelf, the heavy cream-coloured bowl with the chip on its rim, and she had measured the flour by feel the way her mother taught her, 2 cups and a palm more. And she had set the dough to rise on the radiator while the rest of the building slept. The only difference this Friday was that there was no one left to carry it to. For 9 years she had baked a loaf every Friday for the old man across the hall. His name was Walter Brennan, apartment 4C, and he had been the first person to knock on her door when she moved into the building on Delancey, with 2 suitcases, a folding chair, and a daughter who would not stop crying. That was a long time ago. The daughter was grown now, the old man was gone now, and the bread, that Friday, sat cooling on Renata's counter, with no destination, and she could not bring herself to throw it away. You have probably had a neighbour like Walter, or wished you had. Stay with me, because the story of what that bread was really doing for 9 years in the dark is one I have wanted to tell for a long time. Renata was 51 years old, and she cleaned offices at night. She wore a grey uniform with her first name stitched over the pocket in white thread, and she pushed a cart down the carpeted halls of a glass tower 3 blocks from the river, emptying baskets, wiping the long conference tables where men she would never meet decided things that moved through the world like weather. She had done this for 16 years. The pay was $11 an hour when she started, and it was $19 now, and the rent had gone up faster than the wage, the way it always does, and there were months she chose between the gas bill and the phone, and she chose, and she did not complain about the choosing. She knew the building the way you only know a place at night. She knew which floor kept its lights on a timer and went dark at 11 so that she finished it by street glow. She knew the executive on 31 who left half a sandwich in the same drawer every Tuesday for her, never said a word about it, never met her, just left it. And she knew the woman on 28 who cried at her desk some evenings and pretended she had not when Renata came in. And Renata learned to knock softly on the open glass and give her a moment to gather herself, because dignity was the one thing the building could not buy a person, and the one thing Renata had to give. She worked from 10 at night to 6 in the morning, and she rode 2 buses home in the grey, and on Fridays she did not sleep first. On Fridays she went straight to the high shelf and the cream-coloured bowl because the dough had to rise while her body still wanted to lie down, and she had decided a long time ago which one she would let win. She had raised her daughter Maya alone in that apartment on the 4th floor. Maya's father had left when the girl was 2, left for a job in another state that turned out to be another woman, and Renata had folded that grief into the bread and the work and the long nights, and had kept folding until it was small enough to carry. She did not speak ill of him. She told Maya only that some people are passing through and some people stay, and that the staying was the thing that counted, and she lived as if she believed it because she did. Walter had stayed. He was already old when she met him, already a widower, a thin, straight-backed man who had taught high school history for 38 years and retired into the quiet of 4C with his books and his radio and a heart that the doctors said was tired. He kept to himself at first. So did she. Then, the morning after she moved in, exhausted and frightened and out of money, with $11 in her wallet and a crying child and a refrigerator that held a half-gallon of milk and nothing else, she had opened her door to the smell of coffee and found him standing there with 2 cups on a tray and a paper bag of rolls from the corner bakery. He had not asked if she needed anything, he had simply made the thing she needed and brought it. He said plainly, the way she would come to know he said everything, that the first week in a new place was always the hardest, and that she should not have to face it without breakfast. Set the tray on her folding chair because she had no table yet. He poured the coffee. He broke a roll in half and gave the bigger half to Maya, who had stopped crying the moment she saw it, and the old man crouched down to the girl's height with his knees cracking and told her, gravely, as if it were the most serious business in the world, that a person who eats a good roll on a hard morning would be all right in the end. Then he stood and he nodded at Renata, and he went back across the hall and closed his door and left her standing there holding a cup of coffee she had not asked for and could not have afforded to buy, with her throat too tight to thank him. She never forgot that, a man she did not know standing in a hallway holding a tray. It is a small thing. It is the kind of small thing that decides what a person becomes. So when she baked her first loaf in that apartment, a few weeks later, on a Friday, because Friday was the only morning she did not work the night before, she carried half of it across the hall and knocked. Walter opened the door and he looked at the bread, still warm, wrapped in a dish towel, and something moved in his face that she did not understand at the time. He took it with both hands. He said thank you the way some men say a prayer. And the next Friday, she did it again. And the Friday after that, and somewhere in those first months, it stopped being a gift she decided to give and became simply a thing that was true about the world, like the sun coming up, like the river going one direction. Every Friday, a loaf for Walter. She did not know that he had lost his wife to a long illness and that his wife had baked bread every week of their marriage, 41 years of it, and that the smell of a warm loaf coming through his door on a Friday morning was the only thing in 9 years that made the apartment feel like she might still be in the next room. He never told Renata that. He was not a man who said such things out loud. What he could not say, he wrote. He wrote a great many things down in a leather notebook he kept in the drawer of his writing desk, the kind with a soft cover gone shiny at the corners from handling, and that notebook is going to matter, so hold on to it. The years went the way years go for people who work nights. Maya grew up. She was a serious girl, watchful, the kind of child who learns early to read a room, because the room is sometimes all she has. She loved the old man across the hall as if he were the grandfather she did not have, and Walter loved her back without fuss, and he tutored her in history at his kitchen table for free. Every week, from the time she was 9 until the day she left for college on a scholarship, he had quietly helped her chase. He wrote her letters of recommendation in a hand so careful it looked engraved. He told her she had a mind like a key that fit a lock most people never found. And when she got in, when the thick envelope came, it was Walter. She ran to first, across the hall, the envelope shaking in her hand, and it was Walter who wept. Not Renata, Walter, the old history teacher, sitting in his chair with his hand pressed to his mouth. Renata watched all of this and gave thanks for it in her plain, quiet way, and kept baking, and did not once wonder what she was owed. That is the thing you have to understand about her. She did not keep a ledger. She did not think the bread was building toward anything. She thought the bread was the thing itself. Then Walter began to fail. It happened the way it happens, slowly, and then all at once. He stopped going down for the mail. Renata started bringing it up, and then started bringing up more than the mail. Soup on the days he could not cook, the newspaper, his pills lined up in the plastic box, with the days of the week on it. She did not call it caretaking, she called it Tuesday. She sat with him in the evenings before her shift, and he talked more than he ever had about his wife and his students, and a war he had been too young for, and a brother he had outlived. And Renata listened, because listening was another kind of bread. She had a great deal of it to give. He asked her once, near the end, why she had never missed a Friday. He was propped up in the chair by the window with a blanket over his knees, his hands too thin now, the skin gone papery, and he watched her move around his kitchen the way a man watches something he is trying to memorize. 9 years, he said, and not one Friday. There were Fridays you were sick. There were Fridays it snowed so hard the buses stopped. You came anyway. He wanted to know why. And Renata, wiping down his counter, not even turning around, because she could not have said it to his face, said that he had brought her a tray of coffee when she had nothing, and that you do not forget the people who knock when you are at your lowest, and that the bread was just her way of knocking back. The old man was quiet for a while. Then he said, so softly she almost missed it, that she had no idea what those Fridays had been. She thought he meant they were a nuisance, that she had been a bother all these years, and she started to apologize, and he lifted one thin hand off the blanket to stop her, shook his head, and could not finish whatever he had meant to say. That night, after she left for her shift, he opened the leather notebook and wrote for a long time, longer than he had written in months, and in the morning the pen was still uncapped on the desk where his strength had given out before he could put it away. He died on a Thursday in the early morning in his sleep, which is the mercy people pray for and rarely get. Renata found him when she brought up the soup. She sat with him a while before she called anyone. She held his cold hand and she thanked him out loud in the empty apartment for the tray of coffee and the 38 years of students and the way he had loved her daughter. And then she did what had to be done, and she made the calls, and the calls were brief because there was almost no one left to call. The funeral was small. A few old colleagues gone grey who had not seen him in years and spoke in low voices about a man they remembered as younger than themselves. The super turning his cap in his hands by the door. A woman from the church who came to every funeral because she could not bear the thought of an empty pew. The priest who had not known Walter read the standard words over the closed casket, and they were true enough, but they were not about Walter, they were about anyone. And Renata sat in the third row in the one good dark dress she owned and felt the wrongness of it, that a man who had loved so particularly should be buried in words that fit no one. When the priest asked if anyone wished to speak, the silence stretched long, and the colleagues looked at their hands, and Renata, who was not a woman who stood up in rooms, almost rose and then did not, because she did not have the words yet for what those Fridays had been, and she would not understand them fully until a son she had never met handed her a notebook. So she sat, and the loaf of Friday bread sat, forgotten on her counter at home, cooling, with no one to carry it to. What she did not know, what no one in that church knew, was that Walter Brennan had a son. His name was David. He was 46 years old, and he lived an ocean away, in a city of canals and grey light, where he had built something out of nothing over 25 years. He and his father had not spoken in a long time, not from hatred, from the slow erosion that happens when a young man leaves angry and a proud old man will not write first, and the years stack up like unpaid interest until the silence is so tall that neither of them can see over it. David had left at 21 after a fight. He could no longer remember the words of only the heat. He had built a life. D. He had married, and the marriage had ended, and he had no children. And somewhere in his 50s coming toward him, he had begun to feel the shape of the silence with his father as the largest thing in his life, the thing all the rest of it was arranged around. He had meant to call. People always mean to call. The notice reached him through a lawyer, a local attorney whose number Walter had kept current in the drawer for exactly this purpose, and when David read the email in his office at 6 in the evening, with the canal going dark outside his window, he stood up and he could not sit back down. He read it 3 times. The words did not change. His father had died in his sleep on a Thursday, and the funeral was already arranged, and there was the matter of the estate. And David noticed, with a strange, detached clarity, that his hands had gone cold. He booked the first flight. He did not pack so much as throw things into a bag. He told no one because there was no one to tell who would understand what he had lost, since most of the people in his life did not know he had a father at all, had assumed for years that the silence meant the man was dead, and David had let them assume it, which was its own small cruelty he would have to live with now. It was 8 hours in the air, and he spent most of it not sleeping, looking at the small map on the seatback where a tiny plane crawled across a dark ocean toward a city he had not seen in 25 years, toward a father he was already too late to reach. He tried to remember the last thing he had said to the old man, the words of the fight. And he could not. He could only remember the door closing and his own footsteps on the stairs, 21 years old, and certain he was right about everything, and the certainty had carried him across an ocean and built him a fortune and left him here, in seat 14A, an unrecognizable amount of money in the bank, and not one person in the world who had known him as a boy. Somewhere over the water, he stopped fighting it and let himself say under his breath, to a father who could not hear him, the word he had not said since he was a child. Dad. It came out cracked. The man beside him pretended not to notice, which was its own kindness, and David turned his face to the dark window and let the rest of the flight pass. Have you ever waited too long to say a thing to someone and then run out of time to say it? Tell me about it sometime. First, let me tell you what David found when he landed. He came straight from the airport, suitcase still in hand, to the building on Delancey. because the lawyer had told him the apartment had not yet been cleared, and the key was with the super. He climbed the stairs he had climbed as a boy. He stood in the hallway of the 4th floor, and across from his father's door 4C was another door 4D, and the whole hallway smelled, faintly, impossibly, of fresh bread. He did not understand it. His father had lived alone. His father could barely boil water, had burned toast the whole of David's childhood, and laughed about it. The smell made no sense, and yet it was unmistakable. Warm and yeasty and homelike, the exact smell of David's own boyhood, Friday mornings before everything went wrong. And it was coming from under the door of 4D, and David, exhausted and grieving and unmoored in a country that no longer felt like his, did the thing he had not planned to do. He set down his suitcase. He knocked. Renata opened the door in her grey uniform because it was nearly time for her shift, and she found a tall stranger standing in her hallway with a suitcase and red-rimmed eyes and a face she had never seen, yet somehow had seen, somewhere in a photograph, in a younger version, in a frame on Walter's writing desk that she had dusted 100 times. She knew before he said a word. "You have his eyes," she said. It was not a question. David Brennan stood in that hallway and looked at the woman who had answered the door across from his father's, the woman who smelled of the bread that filled the corridor, and he said that he was Walter's son and that he had come too late, and that he did not know who she was, but that something in the air of this hallway felt like the only warm thing he had walked into in 25 years. Renata stepped back and opened the door wider and told him to come in and sit down, because that is what you do, because he looked like a man who had not been told to sit down in a very long time. And on her counter, cooling, was the loaf she had baked that morning with no one to give it to. She cut it. The knife went through the crust with that small tearing sound, and the steam came up, and she put 2 slices on a plate with a little butter and a cup of coffee, the way an old man had once done for her in this same hallway, and she set it in front of him without a word, because some griefs do not want talking, they want only to be fed. David Brennan, who could afford anything in the world, who had eaten in rooms with chandeliers and waited on by people whose names he never learned, ate the bread of a stranger at a chipped formica table under a bare kitchen bulb, and his shoulders began to shake, and he wept the way men weep who have not done it in decades, silently and then not silently. And he could not have told you why, except that it tasted like a home he thought he had thrown away. Renata did not stop him and did not crowd him. She put the kettle on again. She had learned a long time ago that the kindest thing you can do for a person who is finally letting something go is to stay in the room and keep your hands busy, and let them know without saying it that they are not alone. She told him slowly over the coffee who she was, the neighbour, the one who baked. She did not make herself large in the telling. She mentioned the Friday bread only because he asked about the smell, and even then she said it the way you mention the weather. That she had brought his father a loaf every Friday for 9 years, that it was nothing, that the old man had been good to her and to her girl. David set down his cup. 9 years, he said, every Friday. She nodded, and he began to understand that the woman across the hall had given his father something he himself had withheld for a quarter of a century. Presence. The plain, reliable fact of a person who came back every week, without being asked, without being owed. He had sent his father nothing in 25 years, not a letter, not a call, and this stranger in a cleaning uniform had baked the man bread 52 times a year for nearly a decade, and the math of that, the sheer arithmetic of her faithfulness against his absence, sat down on David's chest and would not get up. The full weight of what Renata had done, though, David did not learn at that table. He learned it 3 days later in his father's apartment from the notebook. He had been clearing the place slowly alone, touching the spines of the books his father had taught, from the radio, the chair, the brown cardigan still hanging on the hook by the door, with the shape of the old man's shoulders worn into it. He had not been able to take it down. In the drawer of the writing desk, under a folder of old report cards and a recommendation letter draft with Maya's name on it, he found a leather notebook. He sat down in his father's chair, which still held the faint dent of a body that had sat in it for 20 years, and he opened it, and he read his father's handwriting for the first time in 25 years, and the sight of that careful, slanted hand, the same hand that had signed his childhood permission slips. undid something in him before he had read a single word. It was not a diary, exactly, it was an accounting. Walter had written down, week by week, year by year, the things that had kept him alive after his wife died and his son disappeared. There were entries about the radio programs he listened to and the books he reread and the weather. There were entries David saw about him, about the son, scattered through the years like stones dropped in a deep well. Wonder where he is tonight. Saw a man on the street with his walk and followed him a block before I knew it was not him. If he ever comes back, I will not say a word about the years, I will only put the kettle on. David had to close the notebook and sit with his eyes shut for a while before he could go on. And on a great many of the pages, in that careful engraved hand, was a single recurring line. Friday. Renata brought bread. And sometimes more. The girl came for history. Brought soup. She has so little and gives it like she has everything. And once, near the end, in a shake your hand, a line that David read 4 times before he could see it through the water in his eyes. If I have any way left to thank her, I want her looked after. She does not know what she has been to me. She thinks it is only bread. And then, folded into the back of the notebook, was a letter. Sealed. Addressed in Walter's hand to a name David recognized the lawyer's name, with a second line beneath it, to be opened only by my son when he comes. Because Walter had known his son would come too late for the living man and had left him a door to walk through anyway. David opened it that night, alone, in the chair, and what was in it changed the shape of 2 lives. Before I tell you what the letter said, let me say only this. Walter had retired on a teacher's pension and lived in a rent-controlled apartment and wore the same brown cardigan for 15 years. No one who looked at him would have guessed there was anything to leave. Yet a man who teaches for 38 years and never wastes a dollar and quietly buys a little of a good company every month for half a century is not a poor man at the end. He only looks like one. And Walter had looked like one on purpose, because he did not want to be loved for what he had. He wanted to be loved the way Renata loved him, for the tray of coffee, for the Friday bread, for nothing at all. The letter was instructions. The first part was for the lawyer, and it concerned the bulk of what Walter had built over 50 years, which was a great deal more than anyone imagined, more than $1 million, grown $1 at a time from a salary that never broke $50,000. And the second part was for David, and it was 3 sentences long. He asked his son to forgive him for being too proud to write first. He told his son he had loved him every single day of the silence. And he asked one thing only. In return for an inheritance David had not earned, and at first did not feel he could take. He asked David to make sure that the woman across the hall, the one who baked the bread, never spent another night choosing between her gas bill and her phone. David read those words, and he sat in the dark a long time. Then he did something that surprised him. He started to laugh very softly, and the laughing turned, the way it does, and he put his face in his hands, in his dead father's chair, and he let 25 years come out of him, all at once. In the morning he knocked on 4D again. Renata was just home from her shift, still in the grey uniform, tired in the particular way of a woman who has worked while the city slept. She made coffee. David sat at the table where he had wept 3 days before, and he told her, plainly the way his father told things, that Walter had left a letter, and that the letter was partly about her. She thought she had misheard. She was sure she had misheard. When he said the number, when he explained what her old neighbour had quietly built and what he had asked be done with a piece of it, Renata put both her hands flat on the table as if the table might tilt, and she shook her head and she said no. She said she had not baked bread for 9 years to be paid for it. She said the bread was not a bill. She said Walter did not owe her anything, that it was the other way around, that he was the one who knocked first all those years ago with a tray. And David, who had come 8 hours across an ocean to bury a father he had failed, looked at this woman refusing a fortune at her own kitchen table because accepting it would make her faithfulness into a transaction, and he understood at last completely why his father had loved her. He did not argue with her about money. He had learned in 3 days of reading, a dead man's handwriting, that you do not reach a person like Renata through money, so he reached her another way. He told her about his mother who had baked bread every Friday for 41 years, and who had died and whose absence had hollowed his father out. He told her that the smell of her Friday loaf coming under his father's door had been, in his father's own written words, the only thing that made the apartment feel like she might still be in the next room. He told Renata that she had not been baking bread for 9 years. She had been keeping a dead woman in the next room for a grieving old man every single Friday, and she had done it without knowing. And there was no amount of money in the world that was payment for that, and that was exactly why his father had not framed it as payment. He had framed it as a son honouring what his father loved. He was not paying her. He was finishing his father's last sentence. Renata wept then, not for the money. For the 41 years of Friday bread she had never known she was echoing. For the woman she had never met, whose place she had unknowingly held. For Walter, sitting alone behind his door every Friday morning, breathing in the warm smell and letting himself believe, for the length of one loaf, that his wife was still alive. You see, she had thought it was only bread. It is never only bread. The things we do faithfully when no one is keeping score in the dark before the city wakes, those are the things that turn out to have been holding up the whole sky. Renata did not know what her Fridays were doing. That is what made them holy. She gave without a ledger, and the world, which keeps a ledger even when we refuse to, had been writing her name down the whole time. They did not settle it that morning. Renata was too proud and too stunned, and David was too wise to push. Instead, he stayed in the city. He extended a trip that was meant to be a week into a month, and the month into a season. And he came to understand that he had not crossed an ocean only to close out an estate. He had crossed it to learn how to be a son again, from a woman who had been a better child to his father than he had, and who was teaching him, without meaning to, how a person stays. He met Maya. Ada. She flew home from the city where she worked, now a young woman in a good coat with her mother's steadiness in her face, and when David told her about the notebook, about the history lessons recorded in Walter's hand, the girl who has a mind like a key, she went very still, and then she asked if she could see her own name in the old man's writing. And David gave her the notebook and left her alone with it in Walter's apartment, in Walter's chair, and what passed between that young woman and those pages is hers, and not ours. He waited in the hall. When she came out a long while later, her eyes were swollen, and she was holding the notebook against her chest, the way you hold a thing you are not going to give back, and she did not say anything, and David did not ask, and the two of them stood in the fourth-floor hallway outside the door of the old man who had loved them both in his quiet, particular way, and the hallway still smelled faintly of Friday bread. The thing was finally settled, not at a kitchen table, but at the bakery on the corner. The same bakery whose paper bag of rolls Walter had carried to a frightened new neighbour 20 years before. It had a hand-lettered sign in the window, gone yellow at the edges. It had been for sale for a year because the old baker, a stooped man named Sal, who had run it for 4 decades, wanted to retire to be near his grandchildren, and no one in the neighbourhood had the money to take it on, and the chains that might have bought it did not want a narrow shop on a side street that smelled of an older way of doing things. David had walked past it a dozen times that season. He had bought his coffee there in the mornings, because it was close, and he had watched Sal work the counter alone, slower every week, and he had watched the regulars come in not only for the bread, but to be known for a minute before they went back out into a city that did not know them. One afternoon he stopped, and he looked at the sign a long time, and he understood what his father would have done, because his father had already done it once. With a paper bag on the worst morning of a stranger's life. He did not give Renata money. He had finally found the one thing she would not refuse, because it was not a gift to her. It was a way for her to keep giving. He bought the bakery, and he sat with Sal and learned the ovens and the suppliers and the names of the regulars so that nothing good would be lost in the handover. And then he put it in Renata's name, the deed clean and simple, and he told her she never had to push a cleaning cart down a carpeted hall at midnight again unless she chose to, because there was a whole neighbourhood of people on Delancey who had been a little bit hungry for a long time, and she was the one the old man had trusted to feed them. Renata Cole stood in the doorway of that little shop with the keys in her hand and the smell of someone else's flour still in the walls, and she did not say anything for a long time. Then she asked David one question. She asked if she could keep Fridays free. Because Friday, she said, was the day she baked for Walter. She was not going to stop just because he was gone. She would bake a loaf every Friday morning the way she always had, and she would carry it down the block to whoever on that street was new, or frightened, or out of money, or alone, the way she had once been, the way an old man had once found her. A loaf for the next person who needed knocking on. David said yes. Of course, he said yes. And then this man, who had built an empire of grey glass and ocean away, asked the woman who had taught his father's heart to keep beating whether she might teach him too, to bake a loaf, because he wanted, just once, to carry warm bread to someone who did not expect it, the way his mother had, the way Renata had, the way the whole long chain of it went back further than either of them could see. She taught him on a Friday. 4 in the morning, the high shelf, the cream-coloured bowl with the chip on its rim, 2 cups of flour and a palm more, measured by feel. He was clumsy and he laughed at himself, and the dough stuck to his hands, and Renata, watching a grieving rich man learn to do the one thing his father had needed most and never received from him, felt something close in her chest that had been open and aching for a long time. A year later, the bakery on the corner had a line out the door on Saturday mornings and a basket by the register, unmarked, that anyone could take a roll from for nothing. No questions, the way Walter took his first loaf with both hands like a prayer. Maya came home more often. David came back twice a year and stayed longer each time, and the neighborhood that had watched a tired night cleaner push her cart for 16 years now watched her unlock a shop at dawn in an apron with her own name over the pocket, and they did not know the whole story, and they did not need to. They only knew the bread was good, and the woman behind the counter looked at every person who came in as if she had been waiting for them. And every Friday, no matter how long the Saturday line had been, Renata closed the shop for 1 hour in the morning. She pulled down the cream-coloured bowl. She baked a single loaf by hand, the old way, and she carried it, still warm, wrapped in a dish towel, to whoever on Delancey Street had moved in that week with too many suitcases and too little money, and a child who would not stop crying. She knocked, and when the door opened, she held out the bread with both hands, and she said the thing the old man had said to her, that the first week in a new place is always the hardest, and that no one should have to face it without breakfast. If you have someone who knocked on your door when you were at your lowest, someone who came back every week without being asked, go tell them today, before the 8-hour flight, before the closed casket, before the letter you find too late. Tell them while the bread is still warm. And if this story sat with you the way the smell of that bread sat in the hallway, stay with me, because the next one is about a woman who left the same diner tip every single day for 6 years, and the man who finally asked her why. The casket had been closed and the church had been nearly empty, yet the bread was still rising somewhere, the way it always is, in some dark kitchen before the city wakes, in the hands of some tired person who thinks it is only bread. It is never only bread.